Open University.
Hey class, let's celebrate diversity today. Celebrate but never measure diversity. This seems to be the golden rule. Because if you measure diversity, you will create anxiety about difference, both to the left and the right wings of society, if you like, both to those who don't want it rubbed in to their faces, to their noses, that they have their noses rubbed in the fact that they live in a pluralistic and diverse society, and they may not want that, but also to those who associate the measurement of difference with things like Nazi eugenics. So we're going to come back to that. Hold that thought for the moment. What do you think of when somebody says celebrate diversity? I personally think of Benetton. We've been talking about Benetton this week. I think of those 1980s billboard ads of the black mother suckling the white baby, or the two kids, the toddlers, one white, one black, kissing each other. Or you think of a stock shot from a photo library of that happy group of, 10 people, they're computer users, or there might be a sales team or whatever, and there's one Asian, there's one black, there's two or three white, there's always women, and there might be one Indian, So there's sort of the stock shot idea of a diverse, happy family who are all from different ethnic origins. That is celebrating diversity. What the cynic might say, the political cynic might say, that when the West talked about, and unfortunately we have to use the past tense because this is not the discourse of today. Today's discourse, pandering to populism, to newspapers like the Daily Mail or news networks like Fox News in the US, is very much to not to celebrate diversity, basically to scapegoat the racially other. But I think what it really, even in the good old, bad old days of neoliberalism, at the height of this system, which we both loathed and loved in some ways, because it had its own kind of economic liberalism, but also a kind of social liberalism which went along with that. I think the hypocrisy of the Celebrate Diversity statement was that essentially it was for two reasons that you were supposed to celebrate diversity. One, because your populations had immigrants who were perhaps ex-colonials. So if you had the British Empire, for instance, or you had slavery in the US, you have a population of coloured people or racially other people in the US and the UK, and they become then a sort of massaging or airbrushing process by which they become diversity. Magically, there's a diverse population in London or New York or whatever, and it's just there by magic, We don't really talk about the fact that that's the result of a colonial situation. So it becomes a bit of a liberal quandary. You can't really say that the colonies were a good idea, but you do have to say that diversity, which is the direct result of colonial power in the 19th century or the 20th century, is a good thing. The other thing, of course, is that we have, just as we had colonies, we also have a declining, aging population, declining birth rate, maybe even negative birth rate, and therefore we need to import labour. The economic machinery requires cheap labour, which tends to be immigrant labour. So we need to do what Germany did when it asked the guest workers in. Speaking of Germany, it occurred to me, since we were talking earlier this week about David Goodhart's book, The Road to Somewhere, it occurred to me that what he's doing with his distinction between the somewheres and the anywheres, I being an anywhere, a citizen of nowhere, a global citizen, what he's really describing there is something Max Weber and Ferdinand Tönnies, who was Tönnies, I think you should pronounce it, who was a German sociologist whose terms Weber was actually picking up on and expanding. The terms Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. Gesellschaft. That is essentially the division that Goodhart is using. Whether he knows it or not, I don't know if he goes into this in his book. And so basically Gemeinschaft is usually translated as community, and Gesellschaft is society. Gemeinschaft, and actually the German term for the European Economic Union, community, EEC, is Europäische Ökonomische Gemeinschaft, so that it's more like a family. It's a little group. They like to describe it as a group of countries who've sort of become a new family. You have to see the Gemeinschaft as tribal and the Gesellschaft as somehow a series of contracts, economically rational. It's a much bigger, more impersonal structure of unity. So basically the ties that bind the Gemeinschaft, the tribal ties, affective ties, familial ties, the ties of necessity. And this is where we come back to my idea about elective affinities, or kindred by choice. That alternative translation of Goethe's novel is very important. Kindred by choice. How does that even make sense? How can you be kindred, in other words, someone's family, part of a family, by choice? That implies that you would have a family of origin, your real family, and you'd have a family of destination, the people you chose to end up living with. That is very much how I do live. I have a country of origin, a family of origin, and we all do have two families, in the sense that if you found your own family, that's the second family you're part of, the second nuclear family. The first would be your parents and your brothers and sisters, your siblings. We can't choose our families, but we can choose the people we reproduce with to create the next family, the second family. If we don't reproduce, that second family might be a group of people we just choose to live amongst. In my case, I live in Japan, which is a very not celebrating diversity culture. So I'm here as a slightly problematical immigrant, or a foreign presence at least, in Japan. And it's interesting because you have some upsides and downsides. You have the benefit of sort of invisibility. I would liken it, if I had to reach for a metaphor, I'd say it's a bit like the famous case where Queen Victoria didn't believe that such a thing as lesbianism was possible, and therefore a governess who'd been clapped up to her, shopped to her as a lesbian, was allowed to go scot-free. You wouldn't fire someone for a sin which is unthinkable or simply doesn't exist. So if Queen Victoria doesn't believe that lesbianism can exist, she's not going to persecute lesbians, put it that way. In order to persecute people, you have to first of all admit their existence as a category. So it's almost like here in Japan, foreign people are totally invisible because the Japanese don't even kind of want to admit we exist. That's the sort of subjective feeling. But recently it's been brought to my attention that this phrase celebrating diversity is back, especially here in Japan. There's a 30-minute Bloomberg TV show concocted in partnership with the Japanese government about how Japan is now celebrating diversity, wouldn't you know it? And I believe it. The Japanese population is declining more rapidly than any other advanced society's population. They desperately need immigrant workers. They're also trying to expand their tourism. So they want a lot of foreigners to come to Japan and spend money, but also to come to Japan and earn money, to work in 24-hour supermarkets and all the rest of it. So I think, I haven't seen this program yet, but I can very well see that it's the same basic logic as the Western celebrating diversity. Bloomberg is an exemplary neoliberal from that, the sort of Benetton end of the liberal end of the neoliberal scale, let's put it that way, the wishy-washy humanist end of that scale, which is that okay, we need the labour. It's an economic argument, essentially, that we want immigrants to come because we need cheap labour. But also, while they're here, let's at least celebrate diversity, or let's talk the talk. So it is interesting that you have to, I think anything which has to be celebrated is in trouble, especially if it only has one day a year to be celebrated, like, oh, it's Women's Day. This one day out of 365 days, it's Women's Day. So, but I have to say, I drank the Kool-Aid very much. I believe in not only this idea of elective affinities and, going from the family you don't choose to a family you do choose, but also the idea of celebrating diversity. Because if I think of when I moved to London in the 80s, 1984, I moved to London from Scotland. London was a dizzying place, a cauldron of bubbling possibilities, and I think amongst those was the idea of exogamy. Exogamy, which is a basic biological principle. You have endogeny and you have exogamy. Endogamy. Endogamy, endo means inside, exo means outside. Endogamy, gamy is like the same as in the word gamete. It's about mating. So mating within your tribe, the extreme logic of mating within your tribe, which is the logic of the somewheres as well, in David Goodhart's terms, the people who stay rooted and stay in one place, is to marry your cousin, or worse, your sister. So people always make fun of rednecks as, inbred and mentally retarded because they married their sisters, And actually, in some cases they did, if not the barnyard animals. Cut that, Nick. But exogamy is the delight of indulging in this thing, which is unfairly called miscegenation. You know you're in trouble when the thing you're doing is described with a word that begins with the prefix misandry, misanthropy, miscegenation. It sounds horrible, but it actually means you're having sex with a person of a different race and reproducing and having a half-caste offspring, a child who is both races. So I didn't actually miscegenate because I didn't have children with my Bangladeshi wife, but I certainly was very drawn to the Bangladeshi community in London and really liked my wife's in-laws as well. I mean, my wife's family, and although they didn't like me particularly, there was a resistance in the families on both sides, I have to say, but probably more on her side. But I love, to this day, I love that Bangladeshi community, Brick Lane, Whitechapel, precisely for not assimilating, at least not 100%, with the British. The modern cant, the dog whistle racist cant, is all about, well, if these immigrants are here, and we don't really like that in the first place, but if they are here, they should at least adopt British ways of life, and even people are having to pledge ridiculous allegiances and go through arcane knowledge of the pathetic constitutional situation in Britain, which should have been scrapped and replaced. We should have had a revolution like the French did, but we never did. So you're supposed to bone up on all this stuff to prove that you're really even more British than the British and believe ridiculously in the absurd things that the British state is founded on. I believe absolutely the opposite. I think that there is a right not to assimilate, a right to not even to learn to speak English if you're in an English-speaking country. I haven't learned Japanese. I mean, I've learned some Japanese, but I think what I like is the irreducible foreignness that's allowed to exist. But here we come to one of the essential problems, the idea of repressive tolerance, or the idea of why do you need tolerance in the first place? Why do you need to celebrate diversity in the first place if you really believe in diversity? And this is where we come back to Hitler. Haha, you knew it. Because the Nazis did experiments in eugenics, in cranial measurement, in phrenology, this kind of thing, in the service of their toxic ideology, which put themselves at the top of a racial hierarchy in the 1930s and 40s, we are supposed to shy away from all types of physiological measurement of racial difference, for instance, or IQ. Even IQ, Hans Eysenck, largely responsible for the popularity of IQ in the 50s and 60s, deeply out of fashion by the 80s and 90s, when a certain kind of slightly contradictory political correctness said that we should celebrate diversity but never measure it. Celebrate but never measure diversity. I was particularly keen, and I'm keen on any kind of structuration which is not, not the obvious one. And my problem with Goodhart is, and all those who think like him, is why on earth should race be the only thing that structures our affinities? Why this tribal loyalty, race and family, or place, race and place? Why essentially blood and soil? Why is that so important when there are so many other ways you could structure your affinities, which would imply that I can jump across to live in Japan, and I can say that I have a body type affinity with the Japanese, but I could equally say that I have a sexual affinity, or all sorts of elective affinities, things that I've chosen to feel with the Japanese because of, and that those should be measurable. So, for instance, the body type affinity. This is something I based on my affection for William Sheldon, who was a typologist who, in his early life, he would classify pennies. There were all these different types of pennies in America in circulation at that time, talking about the early 20th century. And Sheldon devised a system to classify the 137 different types of penny, or whatever it was. Later on, he developed the same idea about human bodies. The body, which of course is a repressed value in Puritan culture. Puritan culture has endless problems with scientific approach to the body, and Sheldon ran up against this fairly quickly because he was taking nude photographs of Ivy League college students, and this became a scandal, still a scandal to this day, and you can read people saying that their lives were destroyed by having to pose naked, when they were students for this Sheldon guy. He had no pervy interests. He was purely a typologist, physiological theorist who believed that body type could be linked to personality, something that the psychologists of the humours had been doing hundreds of years ago, but he wanted to do it on a more scientific basis. So he had this basically three types of bodies: the fat, the muscular, and the skinny, which are based on the way that the human embryo develops. The embryo first of all develops inner organs, then musculature, and then finally the carapace of skin, the outward thing. And the thing is that the skinny person actually has a greater ratio of skin to body weight than the other two types, and therefore an ectomorph is a kind of cringing person. There's too much stimulation all the time. There's too much external data coming in, and you shy away from it as a thin person. But also you have a very active brain. The brain is part of this development of the ectomorph. And so cerebrotonic was his description of the personality type that goes with the ectomorph. The mesomorph is muscular and adventurous and bold and a kind of leader character, and the endomorph is basically enjoys digestion and sociability, affability, teamwork, all the rest of it. And of course you could say there's some sort of hierarchy, for instance, in the 20th century USA. I don't know if it's still true, because I think endomorphy, there's much more obesity now in the US, and there may be a shift in values towards saying that obese character is actually a good thing to be. But in the 20th century, at least, there was this, the sort of Superman ideal of the American superhero. That he's very ripped with muscles, and very dominant kind of a mesomorph. The ectomorph is brainy, but he's a nerd and gets sand kicked in his eyes. And then the endomorph is kind of the fall guy. Might be funny, might be John Candy or John Belushi or somebody like that you would laugh with and at, or even Oliver Hardy. But basically, the prize goes to the muscular mesomorph, who also represented the dominance that the US saw itself having in the world at that time, and indeed did have post World War II. Had its moment it has its mesomorphic moment in the sun. I think that moment is over now, and we're seeing a timorous obesity, physically but also politically dominating in the US. And eating disorders and all the psychology of that really defines the US's relationship with the world. It is a world actually of object relations in the psychoanalytic theory, which comes from Fairbairn and people like that, who are actually Edinburgh psychoanalysts, who talked about the first object being the breast, the mother's breast. So you suckle, you feed from the breast, and all your subsequent relationships with the world are based on what kind of relationship you had with that breast. Did you know it aggressively? Did you give it pain? Did it frustrate you that you couldn't always get milk when you wanted it? All that. Object relations. Melanie Klein, Fairbairn, all those people. So, I don't know. Hitler, yes, Hitler tried to measure people with this evil. But I think that my take on this is that you have to distance Nazism as an evil ideology, which it certainly was, from the fact that they were doing various physiological measurements for their own nefarious purposes. It wasn't. It's not necessary that all measurement of diversity. It doesn't make sense that all measurement of diversity would be in the service for some kind of evil Nazism. And other things the Nazis were really into have not been stigmatized in the same way, like motorway building. They built freeways, they loved freeways, they were the first people to do that. Why has that not been seen ever since as a Nazi thing to do? Simply because it was so universally embraced afterwards. And that's pretty much what I have to say today, just clarifying some of the ideas in the last podcast and thinking about diversity, choice, and all these rather difficult topics. I suppose I'm attracted to them because they are difficult, being a sort of perverse person. I see them all as structurations of your experience. All of them are arbitrary. None of them are... For instance, if a Vulcan civilization landed on Earth, Mr. Spock took over as the world leader, our Gesellschaft, our rationality, our most objective and universalistic systems would be revealed as a kind of Gemeinschaft. That would all slip one position because the rational civilization would see even our most logical structures as illogical, Captain.
Open University.